Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video. My name is Sarah and today we're going to do my May wrap-up, which May was a bit of a slower reading month for me. Like in the beginning I felt like I was taking a long time to get through the books that I was reading. However, it was an absolutely stellar reading month. Out of the 5 books that I did read, 3 of them ended up being 5 stars, which was like crazy to me, and I was not anticipating that, but I was definitely here for it. It was absolutely wonderful. So I'm just gonna, jump into the books that I read. So the first book that I read this month was The Death of Jingle by Caitlin Starling. This is a gothic horror novel. In April, I had read Caitlin Starling's other book, The Luminous Dead, which I really enjoyed that. This is her newest book, and I loved this even more than The Luminous Dead. This is a very, very different concept than The Luminous Dead. First of all, I'd like us all to appreciate this cover. It's absolutely gorgeous and creepy, and it's one of my favorite covers of the books that I've read so far this year. But in this book, we're in maybe like late 1800s, maybe early 1900s, somewhere around there. Like somewhere, I feel like right around the turn of the century. I could be completely wrong, but those are the vibes that I was getting. We don't necessarily get a specific date, but we are following Jane Lawrence, who is a young woman of marrying age, but she is an orphan and an accountant of the kind of family that has raised her, and she kind of became their accountant in order to kind of like give a reason to stay with them as she kind of came of age, but they are moving towns and she doesn't want to move with them, and so her only way of really staying in the town that she's currently living in is to marry someone. And so she decides that she's going to kind of do this like business arrangement for a marriage, and so then she ends up arranging with Dr. Augustine Lawrence kind of this business arrangement where it's more of a marriage of convenience and not necessarily a marriage of love, and he agrees that she'll keep books for him and maybe assist him in his surgery when needed, and in exchange for like the marriage and a place for her to live, as long as she agrees to never ever stay the night at his family home. However, this kind of agreement to never stay the night at his family home gets quickly broken through a series of circumstances that are kind of out of both characters' control, and Jane ends up staying the night there, and things rapidly get out of hand, and that's kind of where the horror things start to take off and the story really gets going there. I will say the horror aspect of this and where this story goes was absolutely bonkers. I could not have guessed like where this story was going. I was super impressed with that and kind of just like the rabbit hole that Starling took us down. I also absolutely loved Jane as a character. I loved Jane and Augustine's kind of relationship and how they had this like really sweet sense of communication in the beginning. Of course, the relationship gets very frazzled when she ends up having to stay the night, and she finds out a bunch of things about his house, and also when she stays the night, he ends up acting like completely different, like a complete 180. He's like scared and like thinks she's an apparition and stuff like that, but I liked how they interacted during those times, but also like when they were kind of like semi-courting each other. I thought that they had really sweet interactions, and it just made the circumstances of the story that much more filled with tension, and like you just wanted to know how this was all going to turn out because you couldn't help but root for them from the very beginning. Jane is one of the most like cold-cut logical characters that I've really come across that has stayed super consistently logical throughout the entirety of the story. Like she does go through growth and character development, and I think Starling kind of navigates this really well, giving her the growth but also keeping her sense of logic and like cool level-headedness consistent throughout the story in various aspects. But I think if you were looking for kind of a new gothic horror to pick up, and that's something that like I personally have never seen before, with like how the gothic horror haunted house type of trope was spun, I would definitely consider picking this up. And I did give this one 5 stars, and I will be on the lookout for whatever Caitlin Starling publishes next. So after that, I read Arm of the Sphinx by Josiah Bancroft. This is the second book in the Books of Babel quartet. The first book being Senlin Ascends. And in that first book, we follow Thomas Senlin as he goes to the mythical Tower of Babel with his newly wedded wife as their honeymoon trip. However, upon arriving, he quickly loses her in this tumultuous crowd that is notorious for separating loved ones or people that are traveling together and then never having them reunite. And of course, this is what happens, and so Senlin has to then start searching the tower to find his wife. And that's kind of the basic premise of the whole series. And of course, the first one starts out like that, and we quickly explode into something much, much bigger, where we learn that this Tower of Babel, each like floor is like an entire kingdom. They call them reigndoms. It's an entire independent, I guess, community, civilization, town, city type of a thing. And then as you climb farther and farther up, you realize how corrupt and sinister this tower actually is underneath. And so this is the second book, and while I enjoyed the first book, there was a lot that I felt like it was lacking. It definitely felt like it was kind of the prequel and what we were just setting up to gear up for the entire story. This book had absolutely everything in it that I was hoping that this series was going to have. We definitely get a lot more details about kind of just like our characters, and kind of more of an in-depth look at them and their relationships with each other, of course. And we get more information about the tower itself and kind of the underground networks and kind of machinations that go on behind all of the seemingly benign tourism traps, which was to be expected, but this had the kind of steampunk, whimsical Alice in Wonderland effect that I was hoping to get from this series. That's kind of the best way that I can think of this to describe this series. Thomas Senlin is a Bilbo Baggins-esque character, so I kind of, in just a nutshell, if you dropped Bilbo Baggins in steampunk Alice in Wonderland, you would get the Books of Babel. I love how you could tell that Bancroft in this second book really kind of pulled out the stops in order to create these different sections of the tower that we got to explore in this second one. They definitely felt like so much more whimsical and creative than the reigndoms in the first book. Not saying that those ones weren't creative and engaging and fun to explore, but I think that the ones that we got to explore in this one were so much more just strange and otherworldly. And I just had a lot more fun with them. And just overall, I am just really enjoying where this book is going. And I'm really, really looking forward to continuing this series. So I highly suggest picking up this series, but give the first, like, just go with the first book, so that you can definitely give the second book a try, because the second book is definitely worth it. And if it needs to be said, I did give this one 5 stars. So then the third book that I read in the month of May was A Tale for a Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. So this is definitely like a literary fiction-esque book. So in this book, we're following 2 different timelines. The present day timeline, we are following Ruth as like the author, as a character, and she's a, you know, struggling author. She's been stopped by this writer's block for a couple years now, and is just kind of like feeling very lost and displaced in her life, and kind of what she wants to do. She feels she has nothing that's really like driving her. She lives on this kind of isolated island in Canada, and one day she's walking the shore of the beach and she stumbles across this bag that is kind of like a freezer bag that's holding a Hello Kitty lunchbox and she takes it home, and inside the lunchbox is a teenager's diary. And the teenager's diary, she quickly figures out, is the diary of a 16-year-old Japanese girl named Nao, and she is kind of writing from this perspective. You find out right away that she's wanting to commit suicide, but she has decided that she's going to fill this journal with her great-grandmother's story. Her great-grandmother is a monk in this kind of very, very small monastery that's kind of up in this mountainous area. And she's done a lot with her life, and so now wants to write about her great-grandmother's life before she ends her own life. And so you are following as Ruth is reading the journal and trying to figure out kind of how Nao's story ends, and also trying to figure out if the kind of washed up Hello Kitty lunchbox was washed up because of the tsunami that happened in Japan just like several months before, or if Nao had indeed killed herself and sent it off into the ocean herself. And so it is a very bleak novel. Going into this, I knew that it was going to be a lot of talk of like suicide. However, I did not anticipate just how bleak it was going to get. So I do definitely think you need to be in a good enough headspace to pick up this book, because we tackle a lot of really difficult topics. There's trigger warnings for abuse, both just physical, mental, emotional, and sexual, as well as obviously suicidal thoughts and ideations. However, there's also this like hopeful feeling and this like sense of connection, despite our main characters Ruth and Nao feeling very disconnected from the world and from kind of life and time itself. There's also because of that sense of connection between both the two main characters who have never met, and as a reader yourself. And I was just absolutely floored with the way that Ozeki was able to put all of this together. How like hard-hitting some of these topics were that she was able to tackle in a very elegant and respectful manner. I was also really impressed with some of the subtle decisions in kind of conversations and relationships between some of the characters that we follow that Ozeki took. Because Ruth is writing herself as one of the main characters, it's impressive to me that she was able to kind of write some of the more grittier and uglier sides, or less savory sides of her life, and kind of her relationship with her husband. And not saying it was like an unhealthy relationship or anything like that. They have a very wonderful relationship. It's just she was able to portray kind of their way of communicating, and how it's like not necessarily always the best way of communicating, the most positive way of communicating between two people. She just definitely didn't hold back and was willing to show that in this story, and I found that really impressive. And I also think that she wrote Nao and her father's relationship very beautifully. That one was really hard to read at times, not because like the abuse came from the father, but because of how lonely the two characters felt, and yet they were right there next to each other, living in the same place. We spend a lot of the book watching as they slowly drift apart, and really hoping that they can like bridge themselves back together in order to save each other and save themselves. And overall, like, I was just really impressed. This one definitely like sat with me for a while after I had read it. I think it's gonna sit with me for a while still, but I did end up giving it 5 stars, and I do highly recommend picking this up. And then next, I needed something a little more lighthearted, because while I was reading A Tale for the Time Being, I was also listening to the audiobook of the Radium Girls, which is the story of the girls in the 1920s who painted the radium dials for watch faces, and then ended up getting radium poisoning and dying horrific deaths from them, and then how the greed from the radium companies and the radium doll companies ended up really just not giving a shit and really screwing the women over and the women's families, and so that was really depressing to listen to and angry and frustrating. I will say I did not get to finish that audiobook. I had taken it out on loan from my library, and I had lost track of time, gotten about 50% of the way through. I know if you keep up on my Goodreads, it said like I was 30% or something like that, but I did end up getting like 50%. I just didn't update my Goodreads before my library loan expired, and of course it had already had a wait list, so now I'm back on the wait list in hopes of getting it back sometime soon and finishing it. While reading those two, it was really heavy topics, really sad, depressing, angering things to read about. So in order to kind of lighten things up a bit, I picked up Finlay Donovan is Killing It by El Casimino, and this, oh my god, this book, this is kind of described as a like cozy murder mystery, and it is absolutely hilarious. So we follow Finlay Donovan. She's a single mother of two who's kind of going through this kind of nasty divorce after she discovered her husband cheating on her with their real estate agent, and she is an author, but she is a B-tier, B-listed author. People maybe even C-tier, C-listed. People don't really know about her books, and she doesn't make a lot of money off of them, and she's not like super successful, and she's struggling now to write her next book. And so she ends up in a Panera Bread talking with her agent over the plot and like ideas behind this new murder mystery that she's writing, and a woman overhears her and thinks that she is a hit woman for hire. And so Finlay Donovan ends up somehow getting wrapped up in a contract to kill this woman's problem husband off, and things absolutely spiral out of control from there. It is hilarious. Casimino has this really funny sense of writing style, and she gives Finlay such a vibrant voice. Finlay comes off the page as just like this like real fully fleshed out mom character, like super early on in the book. Like I said, Casimino has a very distinct writing style, yet she also has a very impressive way of making a series of events play out where they're absolutely ridiculous, yet you could also totally see them just like accidentally domino affecting into this big crazy thing that ends up happening. And it was just a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. I also really enjoyed Finlay and her babysitter's relationship. They kind of end up becoming really close friends and a good duo, and I just think that the female friendship written in this book is just done really well. It's really refreshing and fun to see. This book had me kind of just like cackling from my couch randomly all throughout the entirety of the story. This is the first in a series. The second book did just come out like, I don't know, a month or two ago, and then the third book is already scheduled to come out next January. So I did pick up the second book. I'm hoping to read it relatively soon, especially with how this one ended. I'm very curious to see kind of how things play out in the second one, because this did end in a bit of a cliffhanger. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I ended up giving it 4 stars. And then lastly, I read Juniper and Thorin by Ava Reed. This was an arc granted to me by NetGalley and the publisher, so thank you so much to both NetGalley and the publisher for giving me access to this arc in exchange for an honest review. This is a gothic horror retelling of the Juniper tree, and now because I went into this book anticipating something slightly different than what I ended up getting. I think because I had read maybe like an early synopsis, or I had just like misread the synopsis and misunderstood it when I first read it quite a while ago. I had this like idea in my head of what this book was going to be, and it ended up being that, but like as kind of more of a subplot compared to what it actually is. And so because of that, I do want to like read the synopsis off to you, especially because I want to make sure that I'm putting emphasis on what actually like the story is really mainly focused on. And this synopsis that I read after being like halfway through definitely clears up a lot of the confusion that I was having. So we are set in another time and place within the world of The Wolf of the Woodsman, which was Ava Reed's first book, where a young witch seeks to discover her identity and escape the domination of her wizard father. A gruesome curse, a city in upheaval, a monster with unquenchable appetites. Marlington and her two sisters live with their wizard father in a city shifting from magic to industry. As Oblia's last true witches, she and her sisters are little more than a tourist trap as they treat their clients with archaic remedies and beguile them with nostalgic charm. Marlington spends her days divining secrets in exchange for rubles while trying to placate her tyrannical, xenophobic father, who keeps his daughters sequestered from the outside world. But at night, Marlington and her sisters seek out to enjoy the city's amenities and revel in its thrills, particularly the recently established ballet theater, where Marlington meets a dancer who quickly captures her heart. As Marlington's late-night trysts grow more fervent and frequent, so do the threat of her father's rage and magic. And while Oblia flourishes with culture and bustles with enterprise, a monster lurks in its midst, born of intolerance and resentment and suffused with old-world power. Caught between history and progress and blood and desire, Marlington must draw upon her own magic to keep her city safe and find her place within it. I was under the impression that this was going to be more of like a magical murder mystery type of story. However, this focuses so much more on Marlington and kind of her inner self-destructive thoughts and actions, as well as her relationship with her abusive father and her sisters, and how the three of them kind of deal with the abuse in very different ways, and how Marlington kind of gets the short end of the stick on a lot of things. Reed did a phenomenal job exploring all of the different aspects of abuse and self-harm and self-destructive thoughts, and how complicated all of those things kind of become, and how there's just a very hard to untangle series of layers that come into play with abuse victims, and kind of how they see the world and how they see themselves. And this was written so well in kind of the horror tone, and I was super impressed with that. Of course, Reed's writing style is just as lyrical as always. I definitely commented that their writing style was beautiful in The Wolf and the Woodsman. It's no different here. If anything, with the horror element, Reed's writing style lends to that kind of horrific imagery in a more disturbing and gross manner. So overall, I do think this was a solid installment in Reed's works. However, because I went into this with very different expectations, expecting it to be more of like a very dark fantasy, murder, mystery, horror type of novel, whereas those kind of murder elements that are mentioned in the synopsis don't happen until, like, they happen and they're very briefly touched on throughout the story. They don't become a like focal point of the story until maybe the last third to a quarter of the book. Because of that, I just didn't have as much enjoyment out of the novel as I was expecting. That is kind of more fault on myself for kind of misunderstanding what this book was supposed to be about. But because of that, I did give this 3.5 stars. However, that being said, I do think if you are looking for something that kind of explores the gritty, complicated layers to abuse, and kind of how victims respond to abuse through the lens of horror and fantasy, I do think this is a very important book to pick up, because I do think Reed did a very phenomenal job exploring these themes. So these are the books plus Juniper and Thorin that I read in the month of May. So 5 books is kind of the lowest number that I have read so far this year. Most of the time I end up reading 6 to 7, but despite reading only 5, 3 of the 5 were 5 stars, and the other 2 were very solid reads as well. So if you've read any of these books or you're looking to read them, of course, let me know down in the comments below. I always love hearing your guys' thoughts and opinions on what I end up reading. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching this video. If you haven't already, I hope you consider sticking around even longer and subscribing. But as always, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!